Hello. Welcome to the video topic analysis for the January 2020 public forum debate topic. In this video, I'm going to go over strategy and arguments for both sides of the topic, as well as specific tournament recommendations for how to perform your best in January. But before I do so, I just want to briefly mention that whatever I provide here is not nearly as deep as what you're going to get from the actual champion brief itself. I strongly urge you to check it out. There are many arguments there written with evidence ready to go in case you're tight and need arguments for cases. There's also other more in-depth written topic analyses by former debaters, which can help you come up with future arguments on the topic, as well as general information section that can help you get a good, strong basis of understanding of what's going on this month in January. So without further ado, let's talk about the topic. So this topic is whether or not the United States should stop its sanctions against Venezuela. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the topic, I want to just talk about January tournaments in general. So January is a very competitive month. Probably the most competitive of the year, simply because of how many tournaments there are, right? Basically every weekend there's a major national tournament, starting off with Blake, and then later on moving into tournaments like Emory, Columbia, Lexington, etc., right? There's a huge difference in strategy between these tournaments, right? At the Blake tournament, because it's in December, people generally don't have that much prep on the topic, right? So it really comes down mostly to strategy, right? On later tournaments, it's going to be, as people are accumulating prep, as people are accumulating strategy, it's going to come much more down to your adaptability and ability and your ability to change as the topic changes, right? So constantly be writing new cases, revising holes that you might have, writing new front lines, new blocks, right? That's going to be critical in January, especially with tournaments which is with as good of judging as we see, right? So let's talk about the strategy. Let's talk about the topic. So on this topic, it seems like a pretty classic example of what we've seen in the past in PF, right, on other topics, where on the one side we see really punchy, short-term, really strong, weighable impacts with a high magnitude, whereas on the other side we see more long-term structural, systematic changes that happen, and the weighing there is slightly different, right? So I think that on this topic it's going to be best to keep your link chain as short as possible, even though those might be the most stock arguments, right? And so people might be able to predict what you're running. It's still better because on this topic, those arguments are still so strong, right? And it's better to have a shorter link chain for a few reasons. One, because it means that you can spend more time explaining your impact, right? Because the link chain is shorter, it means you have to spend less time explaining it, right? Because the link chain is shorter, it also means that it's harder for your opponents to respond, because every extra link that you add is another opportunity for your opponents to respond, right? So it means that it's harder for them to come up with more responses. It also means that because that's true, it's easier for you running the argument to predict what responses you're going to hear and to write better front lines to them so that you're more prepared to deal with them later on, and it's easier to defend because it's a simpler argument to begin with. So what are these simple arguments I speak of that are so good? Let's start with the pro. The pro is very simple because it's basically all you have to do is really just explain the harms of sanctions, which are basically just why trade is good and why it's bad to not have trade, right? And there are so many arguments for why this is true. I'm just going to go through a few of the most basic ones, right? But this could be a good starting point for research if you want to come up with even more, maybe more complex or more or less common arguments. Just think about why trade is good and why it's bad to not have trade with a big country like the United States. You're bound to come up with incredible arguments, right? So here's a few basic ones right off the bat. Trade is important because it means that financial institutions in the United States can invest in businesses in Venezuela, right? It gives them access to capital, which means that they can then grow using that capital because they can invest it in their business, for example, expanding the number of stores that they have, hiring more employees, increasing productivity, which means that just generally they're able to make more money because they're able to reach more people, produce more goods, right? Which means that they're able to then employ more people, pay people more, reduce poverty. Furthermore, we think that it allows these companies to trade with the United States, right? Like when they're trading with the United States, that's a direct source of revenue. It's a huge source of revenue because of the large consumer base that exists within the United States, right? And getting rid of that means that companies in Venezuela no longer have access to that capital, no longer have access to that consumer base, right? This impacts poor people on the to the extent that small businesses, which they work for and they own, aren't able to trade with the United States, aren't able to get things like microfinancing from the financial institutions in the United States. It also means that big businesses lose revenue, which is also important for the impoverished people of Venezuela, because big businesses often provide the low-skilled and basic labor that these people depend on, right? And when they're going down and when they're losing revenue, it means that they're not able to employ as many people. And even if they are able to employ as many people, they're paying them certainly a lot less than they otherwise would have, right? It's also worth noting that trade with the United States, at the most basic level, gives people in Venezuela access to the goods that the United States has to provide Venezuela, which are actually quite important, right? The United States is one of the major exporters of medicine, and not being able to have access to medicine from the United States means that people are more likely to die from basic things that they otherwise would have been able to solve and cure very easily simply because of the embargo. Furthermore, you can make the argument that with the lack of money going to the government, it means that the government has to cut back on social services, right? Which means that even if the economy is doing the same, right, there are still people in poverty in Venezuela who rely on services from the government. And with less revenue going there, it means that they have to cut back on social services as well, which means that people are unable to get basic needs like housing from government housing projects, or, for example, medicine from government medical programs, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on, right? The impact here is huge and very, very easy to weigh, right? So people lose access to jobs, people lose access to medicine. It affects their most basic daily and lively needs, right? It possibly makes them sick, makes them hungry, leads them to go into poverty, potentially leads them to die. Very horrific impacts that are extremely easy to weigh in the debate context, right? So I think that in and of itself, in its short-term nature, outweighs possible long-term arguments that the Khan could be making about systemic changes in the Maduro regime that could happen from pressuring them. And we'll get into the fleshing out of those arguments later, but simply first outweighing that, right? So assuming the Khan team is arguing that we allow the sanctions allow us to pressure for more systemic changes to the Venezuelan government, how do we outweigh that? Well, I think that one, the short-term impacts are far more probable, right? Like a lot of the problems that exist in the Venezuelan government have existed for years, right? And we've had sanctions on them in the past. And it's unlikely, and even if it is likely, the chances are far smaller that there's going to be really these radical changes that the Khan team is talking about, whereas we know pretty certainly that without trade, the Venezuelan people are going to suffer pretty dramatically, right? So just on a matter of probability and certainty level, this impact matters more. I also think that it's very easy to outweigh in the long term as well, right? Because I think it's easy to characterize economic harms that happen in a certain time period to merely that time period. But what that analysis misses is that an economic harm over a few years actually leads to huge problems later on, right? So like when a company is unable to sell things anymore to the United States and they're not making as much money anymore, it means that they have to close down branches. They have to close down stores, which took years to build up the money to make, to found in the first place, right? So 1 year loss of a huge amount of money is actually a many years loss of a huge amount of money, because you have to backtrack many years of progress that you've made up to that point by de-developing, right? Not to mention that there's a huge opportunity cost, which means that companies are not able to expand and increase their productivity in a way that they otherwise could have with access to capital, right? That is to say, developing new supply chain techniques, or building more factories or things like that. And these things don't just increase growth like linearly right now and provide people with jobs right now, but it increases growth exponentially, right? Because when you're able to sell to one city, well, then the people in that city then tell the next city, right? And then it branches out from there further and further and further. So you're not missing out on just 1 year, 1 year's worth of growth. You're missing out on like exponential amounts of growth that could have happened later because of the development that you're trading off right now. There's also this huge impact that most people in PF never run, but it's well documented in academic literature, which is that malnutrition and the lack of brain development that occurs from being poor and from not having access to food and from having poor education systems means that people become less productive later on in life and leads to far worse harms that cannot be overcome by any sort of structural change that happens in the government simply because people missed out on food when they were children, which means that now when they're adults, they're not as cognitively capable of doing the work that they otherwise would have been able to do, right? So that impact stands, and it's extremely easy to weigh and very horrific. But now let's talk about the con. So the big con strategy, right, is going to be to explain why all the economic harms that the pro team talks about are largely systematic, right? That is to say that the bulk of the poverty that exists in Venezuela is not caused by sanctions. It's caused by problems within the government that have existed for years, will continue to exist for years. And even if sanctions have a harm on the economy, it's just a drop in the bucket relative to the amount of malaise and the amount of and the lack of oversight and the corruption that goes on in the Venezuelan government, right? Which is to say that any risk of changing that, the root cause of all of the problems in Venezuela, is enough to justify a ballot, right? Because any issues on the margins with regards to sanctions will not matter at all if there's even a 1% chance of changing the fundamental problem that exists in the fabric of the Venezuelan economy, right? So, how do we link into this with sanctions? There are a few different ways, right? So, one thing is to say that the sanctions themselves harm the government, which then pressures them to reform, right? So there's this external pressure coming from the United States government, which is saying like, hey, the reason we have these sanctions on you is because of your mismanagement of the economy. We will get rid of the sanctions if you manage the economy better and become less corrupt. Do that, and we'll get rid of the sanctions. So that puts pressure on them. It possibly gets them to change, right? The other thing that it does, what you can do here is you can bite the bullet on all of the pro arguments, right, and agree that yes, the economy is going to get worse, people are going to get sick, people are going to be pushed into poverty, but that's merely short-term, and it's a necessary condition for long-term change. Because when you do so, it means that people then blame the government for this problem. It pushes them to a point where they force institutional change, and then they tell the government that they need protection, and they need government assistance, and that it's no longer acceptable for them to continue with this lazy government action, right? So it then pressures the people to then be angry at the government. So the most likely response you're going to get to this argument, right, is like, why aren't these people going to be angry at the United States, right? But there's many reasons why this is the case. Like, for one thing, people are not very well read up on the news, especially on foreign relations, right, which they think is extraneous to their interests, right? And furthermore, we think that often what people are already primed to dislike the government, right? So any harm that's going to happen, because they've disliked the government for years, and so any harm that happens to them, they're already likely to be blaming the government for, and so this is just one more in addition to that, which can then help them, right? Another response that might be made is that this gives the government a scapegoat, right? It allows the government to blame all of its problems on the United States and say, hey, look, like, it's not my fault that the economy is bad, it's the United States' fault, you should look to them, right? The problem with this is that I think it's fairly easy to argue that no one's going to believe the scapegoat, right? So, like, there have been sanctions in the past, right? And we haven't seen this narrative going on in the past. And furthermore, we think that there's already like a lot of distrust going on towards the government in Venezuela, which means that they're unlikely to buy these narratives that they're telling them. So what's the weighing for this argument? The weighing is very simple, right? I kind of went over it earlier. It's long-term structural changes to the Venezuelan economy and government matter far more than any short-term harms that could possibly happen that the pro team talks about, right? So, like, even if the pro can prove to you that people right now are hurt, right, that's just like and they do all the weighing that I was talking about earlier about how, a harm in 1 year can cause harms later on, right? And like the difference between the two worlds is that in their world, this happens, in a world with sanctions, this happens in 1 year, and yes, maybe it causes harms later on, but at least the next year we can start to rebuild that once the government changes. The alternative scenario where we don't have sanctions, that year of problem, that year of malnutrition, that year of a lack of development happens every year, right? Because of mismanagement in the economy, and so it compounds upon itself over time. And so in that sense, it's very easy to weigh. In the long term, structural issues matter more than short-term impacts. So what I've just done, right, like these are all arguments that I think are great to run. There's definitely so much more to be looked into, right? This is just a sliver of this very complex topic, an issue in Venezuela, which has been going on for decades, right? For more in-depth analysis on this topic, I highly urge you to check out the brief itself, the champion's brief, where you can find, again, pre-written arguments and also more information on the topic so you can become more well-versed in analysis that can allow you to have a jumping-off point for writing cases yourself. With that said, best of luck to you and your competition in January. I'll see you all next month.